For 3 years, no one asked the widow to dance. Her name was Cora Whitfield. She was 38, 3 years a widow, and every fall she sat in the same ladder-back chair beside the cold stove while the schoolhouse floor filled up 2 by 2. She did not stare at the ceiling. She did not pretend to be busy with her shawl. She watched the dancing the way you watch a window you are not allowed through. And she did not cry. At the front of the room, Verna Halloran arranged the sets out loud for everyone to hear. We'll put the Coles across from the Ambroses. She named every family in Cottonwood Bend. Every family but one. 41 neighbors went to the floor. 1 chair stayed still. 2 years of that were already behind her, but every social, the widow sat beside the only other person in the room not dancing. Old Gideon Marsh and his fiddle. And for 3 years, something had been passing between that chair and that fiddle that not one of the 41 ever noticed. If you have ever been left at the edge of a room and quietly learned everything in it, this story is for you. Before we go on, do something small for me. Subscribe so the next story finds you. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. I like to know where these stories land. Now, let me tell you about the widow and the chair and what she was really doing all those years no one asked. It was 1885, in the Wyoming Territory, at a place called Cottonwood Bend. Cora held a thin claim east of the creek. It was not good land. It had never been good land. Her husband had believed it would come around, the way some men believe things, and then he died in the second winter and left her to find out he was wrong. She was useful to everyone. That was the strange part. When a baby came, they sent for Cora. When a fever took a house down, Cora sat up with it. She could set a bone, salt a hog, and turn a collar so it looked new. If a woman needed her bread minded while she birthed, it was Cora's hands that minded it. She was in every kitchen in that settlement at one time or another. And she was invited to nothing. There is a kind of person a small place cannot quite figure out what to do with. A widow with no children and no man is one of them. She is not a wife, so the wives don't gather her in. She is not a girl, so the girls don't either. She is a loose thread. And a place like Cottonwood Bend does not know how to weave a loose thread, so it lets it hang. When her husband died, Cora had folded the music away with his shirts. That is the part no one knew. She had grown up in Ohio under a wooden platform, in the sawdust and lamplight of 100 country dances, because her father was the caller. He was the man who stood above the floor and told it what to do. Balance and swing. Alamande left. Down the center and back. She had learned every call he ever gave the way other children learn hymns, without meaning to, just from being near it, night after night, year after year. She still knew them all, every call her father ever gave, clean and in order, sitting somewhere in the back of her, like water in a covered well. But she never once thought of it as something a person could use. It was just a thing she had. Like the color of her eyes. Something from before. That first fall in Cottonwood Bend, they held the social in the schoolhouse. 1 room. Plank floor, scrubbed for the occasion. A stove in the corner, cold that night because the dancing would warm the place better than any fire. Lamps on the sills. The men pushed the benches back to the walls, and the women laid out the supper on the long table by the door. Verna Halloran ran the dancing. She had run it for years, and she would tell you so if you asked, and if you didn't. Verna was a matriarch of the settling kind. She liked order. She liked her family near the middle of things. She arranged the sets the way a general arranges a field, and to be arranged by Verna was to be counted as a person who belonged. A widow, Verna had decided, was a complication. Where do you put her? You cannot put her with the married couples, because then a husband is dancing with a woman, not his wife. You cannot put her with the young ones, because she is not young. So you do not put her anywhere. You simply move down the room and leave the gap where she is sitting, and you do it so smoothly that it looks like there was never a gap at all. So Cora took the chair by the cold stove. It was the chair nobody wanted, in the corner nobody used, and it was the only seat in the room that did not expect anything of her. She sat down in it the way you sit in a pew. Quietly, like it had her name on it. And beside her, on a low stool, sat Gideon Marsh, tuning his fiddle. Gideon was old. He had been a freighter most of his life, hauling goods over the passes with a team, until a wagon came down on his hand one bad spring and left 2 fingers of his bow hand curled and slow. He could still play. He could play well enough to fill a room. But there were tunes he could no longer reach, and he knew exactly which ones, and he did not talk about it. That first night, Cora didn't mean to speak to him. She was only sitting there, listening, watching the floor fill up without her. But the silence between 2 people who are both not dancing is a particular kind of silence. It asks to be broken. So she asked him the name of the tune he was playing. He told her. "Soldier's Joy," he said, without looking up. She listened to the next one, and asked that too. And the next. And he told her each one, in that flat freighter's voice, like a man reading off a waybill. And then, on the 4th, he stopped in the middle and let his bow drop to his knee and rubbed the 2 stiff fingers with his other hand. "Can't do that one anymore," he said. "Nor 2 others. Not since the wagon." She didn't say she was sorry. He would have hated that. Instead, she hummed it back to him. The whole thing, the tune he had only played half of. She hummed it through to the end, on the first try, note for note, without knowing she was going to. Gideon Marsh turned and looked at her then. He looked at her the way you look at a tool you didn't know was in your hand. Something changed in his face. Not warmth, exactly attention. He had been sitting beside a widow. Now he was sitting beside something else, and he wasn't sure yet what. "Do that again," he said. She did. He didn't say anything after that. He just went back to playing. But he sat a little closer to her chair for the rest of the night, and when he came to one of the tunes he could still manage, he played it a half a shade slower, so she could catch it. That was the first notch. Nobody in the room saw it. 41 people danced, and the corner by the cold stove was just the corner by the cold stove, where the widow sat with the old fiddler. 2 people not dancing. The one place at the social where nothing was happening. At the back wall, near the door, a tall man stood with his hat in his hands and watched the floor and never once stepped onto it. His name was Elias Reddick. He was a carpenter, a widower himself, with a homestead up the draw. He was not a talker. He had come to the social the way a man comes to church he has stopped believing in, because it is what you do, and because the alternative is a cabin and the sound of your own breathing. He watched the dancing. He did not join it. And at some point in the evening, his eyes found the corner by the stove, and the widow in the latter back chair, and the way she hummed something under her breath that no one could hear. He noticed her. That was all. That first night, he noticed her, and he said nothing, and he went home up the draw when the lamps burned low. But he noticed. Winter came in over the ridge, and the settlement went inside itself, the way settlements do. Cora minded her thin claim and her failing garden and the endless small work of staying alive alone. And the next fall came, and with it the second social. That second one was the hard one. That is the one I want you to see. There had been a traveling caller in the county, a man who went from settlement to settlement running the big dances. But he had moved on, or died, or simply not come. Nobody was sure, and so Verna Halloran had no caller and a floor to fill. And when a woman like Verna has a problem, she solves it with more organization, not less. She decided that this year, everyone would dance. Everyone. She would pair the shy boys with the spinster aunts. She would put the old men out with the young wives. She would leave no one against the wall, because a full floor was a triumph and a half-empty one was a failure, and Verna did not fail in public. So she arranged the whole room onto the floor at once. 40-some people, all of them moving. The plank boards shook with it. The lamplight swung. It was the fullest that schoolhouse had ever been, and Verna stood at the edge of it with her arms crossed and her chin up, pleased, and in the middle of all that motion, there was one still figure, Cora, in the chair by the cold stove, the only person in the room not moving. Verna had swept the entire settlement onto the floor and, out of long habit, had swept right past the widow, the way water goes around a stone. She hadn't even done it unkindly. She simply hadn't seen her. A widow was a complication, and Verna's mind had filed her under settled business long ago. I want you to sit in that with me for a second. Because Cora did. Everyone she knew was dancing. Every hand she had ever helped, every child she had ever caught, every fever she had ever sat up with. All of them out there on the floor, laughing, turning, warm, and she was the stone the water went around. Not hated, not driven out, just, somehow, not counted. There is a loneliness in being disliked, but it is a smaller loneliness than being simply forgotten in a room full of people you have served. She did not cry. I told you that at the start, and I meant it. She sat very straight and she watched, and the ache in her was as wide as it would ever get. This was the bottom. And it was Verna, of all people, who said the thing out loud. She was talking to another woman near the stove, not to Cora, in that carrying voice some women have that assumes the help isn't listening. They were watching a spinster aunt stumble through the steps, and the other woman said, half joking, that they ought to just teach one of the women to call the dances themselves and be done with hiring men who never come. And Verna made a small sound, like the idea was distasteful, and said the thing that Cora would carry for the next 3 years. A woman who calls a dance, Verna said, is never asked to one again. She said it lightly. Like a rule of weather, like a thing everyone knew. A woman who stands up above the floor and runs it stops being a woman a man walks across the room to ask. She becomes furniture. She becomes the caller. She joins old Gideon in the corner of things that make the dance happen, and she leaves forever the world of things the dance happens to. Cora heard it. She was 3 feet away in the chair by the stove, and she heard every word, and she understood it completely, because it named exactly the world she was already half inside. And here is the terrible, quiet trap of it. She believed her. She believed Verna. She sat there and took that rule into herself as a true thing about the world, a wall she must never walk into. To call a dance was to give up being asked to one. And Cora, who had been asked to nothing in 3 years, still had not given up the last thin hope of being asked. So she filed the rule away. Never that. Whatever else. Never stand up above the floor. She did not know yet that she was memorizing the one door she would someday have to walk through. Gideon's hand was worse that second year. She could see it. Between sets he would hold it against the warm neck of the fiddle and work the 2 stiff fingers, and there were tunes he started and quietly turned into other tunes because the first one had gotten away from him. And somewhere in that second social, without either of them deciding it, they fell into a new arrangement. When his hand tired, he would lean toward her and say the name of the coming tune, low, and she would carry it in her head. She would hum it under the fiddle, just at his ear, keeping the shape of it, so that when his fingers faltered, he had the whole thing running alongside him to catch on to. She became his memory, his spare hand, made of humming. And in doing it, she learned things she had no name for. She learned that a floor has a temperature, that there is a moment, about 2/3 through a long dance, when the energy sags and the couples start to look at their feet, and that the fix for it is not to slow down, but to change the figure, to give them something new to think about. She learned tempo, real tempo, the difference between the beat on the page and the beat a tired floor actually needs. She learned Gideon's whole trade from the inside, one social at a time, thinking the entire while that she was only being kind to an old man with a bad hand. He told her the settlement's real secret that year, too. He told it to her the way he told her everything, flat, between tunes, not looking at her. Never, he said, put the Pruitts and the Standishes in the same set. She asked why. Landline, he said. Water rights. 20 years back. They'll dance in the same room but not in the same square, and if you put them across from each other you'll have a fist through somebody's fiddle before the night's out. Verna thinks she keeps them apart. She don't. I do. I've been steering them clear so long she thinks it's her arranging. Cora tucked that away with the rest of it. She was learning the machine. She still did not know it was a machine, or that it was a machine a person could run. She thought she was collecting curiosities. She thought she was passing the time in the only corner of the social that would have her. Elias Reddick came again that year. Same wall, same hat in his hands. Still he did not dance. But he was watching more closely now, and he began to notice things about her that no one else troubled to notice. He noticed that Cora never sat down at the supper table. Every social, when the dancing broke and the crowd went at the long table, she was up and moving, pouring, carrying, refilling, minding the children's plates. She never took a seat and ate like a guest. And Elias, who was a quiet man and therefore a watching man, understood something about it that he could not have put into words. She served because serving was the only way she had of having a place at that table. A guest can be forgotten in a corner. The woman with the coffee pot cannot. She had made herself necessary because necessary was the nearest thing to welcome she was going to get. He never said this to her. He never said much of anything to her. When their paths crossed at the door, he touched his hat and said, "Evening, ma'am," and that was the whole of it. But before the third social, he did a thing. The stove corner chair, Cora's chair, the ladder back she always took, had gone loose in one leg. It wobbled. It would tip a person a half-inch every time they shifted their weight, a small nagging thing. Elias noticed it the way he noticed the grain in any bad joint, and one afternoon, days before the social, when the schoolhouse was empty, he came down the draw with his tools and mended it. Glued and pinned the leg, squared it, sanded the mend so smooth you'd never find it. He did not tell anyone. He did not tell her. He just fixed the chair the widow always sat in, so that this year, when she took her place in the corner where no one danced, she would at least not wobble. That was the second degree. A mended chair leg, a carpenter's whole heart in a joint no one would ever see. And Cora sat down in it at the third social and thought only that the chair felt sound this year, and never once wondered why. The third social is where it turned. Gideon's hand had gone from bad to failing. He got through the early sets on will alone, but you could hear it fraying. And then, deep in the evening, in the middle of a reel with 3 squares on the floor, his fingers simply stopped answering him. The bow scraped. The tune fell out from under the dancers all at once, the way the floor drops out of a bad dream. 40 feet lost the beat in the same second. Couples stumbled. Someone laughed the embarrassed laugh people laugh when a thing has gone wrong in public. And Cora, in her chair, without deciding to, without a single thought passing through her about rules or walls or Verna, hummed the count. Loud enough this time. Loud enough to reach the near square. She gave them the beat, and the next figure in that low, clear voice, 1, 2, 3, swing and down the center, the count her father had given 100 floors in Ohio, and 3 couples caught it. They found the beat again off the sound of her, and they danced the reel out to its end on the widow's count while the old fiddler's hand shook in his lap. It lasted maybe 20 seconds. Then, Gideon got his fingers back and lifted the tune again, and the moment closed over like water. Almost no one understood what had happened. They thought the fiddle had faltered and recovered. They did not know that for 20 seconds the dance had run on nothing but the voice of the woman in the corner by the cold stove. But Gideon knew. Gideon heard exactly where it had come from. And when the social ended and the room emptied out into the cold, and the benches were being dragged back and the lamps blown, he did not get up to go. He sat on his stool with the fiddle across his knees, and he waited until it was just the two of them in that corner. Then he reached into his coat and took out a book. It was old and thick and bound in freight hide, the leather gone dark and soft with handling. It smelled of wagon grease and pipe smoke and 40 years of road. Every tune he knew was in it, written in his own cramped hand, with notes in the margins. This one for a wedding. This one when the floor's gone dead. This one's slow. He put it in her lap. Not handed. Set it down across her knees with both hands, the way you set down something you are done carrying. You keep the calls I can't hold anymore, he said. She started to say she couldn't. He talked over her. My hand's finished, Cora. You know it and I know it. This book dies with me if it stays with me, and I got no boy to give it to, and no girl either, and the one person in this whole settlement who can hum a tune back to me clean on the first pass is sitting in this chair. So you keep it. You keep the calls. That's the end of it. She held the book in both hands and did not know what she was holding. She thought it was a kindness. An old man giving away a keepsake to the only person who'd ever sat with him. She did not yet feel the weight of it as what it was, which was a trade handed down. A trust. The whole operating knowledge of the thing pressed into her lap in a cold schoolhouse, while everyone who might have wanted it was already walking home. That night, at her table, by one lamp, she opened it. She turned the soft pages one by one. Soldier's Joy. Money Musk. Turkey in the Straw. All of them there in Gideon's hand. And near the back, on a page more worn than the others, she found one she didn't know. Sweetwater Reel. And underneath the tune, a second passage, written smaller and boxed off, with a note beside it in Gideon's cramped letters. Second part, most don't know it. Hardest. She hummed the first part off the page easy. The second part stopped her. It went somewhere she didn't expect, up and around and back, a strange, sweet turn that didn't sound like anything else in the book. She could read that it existed. She could not hear it. It was written in a language her ear didn't have yet. She would learn later that almost no one in the whole territory had heard the second part of the Sweetwater Reel played in 10 years. That it was one of the 3 tunes the freight wagon had taken from Gideon's hand. That it was, in a way, the last thing he had that no one else did. But that winter she only knew it was a puzzle. And so, when the snow was deep and the road up the draw was a hard white line, she put on her husband's old coat and she walked up to Gideon Marsh's cabin to ask him to play her the part his hand could no longer play. He couldn't play it. Of course he couldn't. That was the whole trouble. But he could sing it. Sitting by his little stove with his ruined hand wrapped around a tin cup, the old freighter sang her the second part of the Sweetwater Reel, cracked and off and true, over and over, until her ear finally caught the strange turn of it and held on. And she hummed it back to him, whole, and his eyes went wet in a way he would have denied to his grave. She went up that draw more than once that winter, and somewhere in those cold visits, without any of them there to see it, the thing that Verna Halloran would never have allowed in 100 socials quietly happened. The widow stopped being the fiddler's company and became the fiddler's apprentice. And then, in March, with the snow still hanging on in the shadows of the draw, Cora Whitfield made the choice that this whole story turns on. She walked up to Gideon's cabin one more time. But not to hum a tune back to him. She sat down at his rough table, and she opened the freight hide book, and she asked him for the thing she had spent 3 years telling herself she must never touch. "Teach me to call it," she said. "Not just the tunes. The calling. The standing up and saying it out loud. The whole of it. The old man looked at her a long time. "You know what that costs a woman here," he said. He'd heard Verna too. Everybody had. A woman who calls a dance is never asked to one again. "I know what it costs," Cora said. And she did. That was the thing. She knew exactly what Verna's rule meant, and she knew that to stand up above a floor was to close the last thin door she'd left open for 3 years. The door where someday, maybe, some man crossed the room and asked her. She weighed it. She sat in that cabin and weighed the small dying hope of being asked against the thing in her hands that no one else could hold. And she chose. "Teach me anyway," she said. So he did. That winter, at a kitchen table with no witnesses, an old freighter with a ruined hand taught a widow how to stand above a floor and run a room with her voice. And Cora took a pencil, and she copied every call into the margins of the book in her own hand, next to his, the timing, the order, the little steering tricks, which 2 families you never, ever put in the same set. She wrote herself into the book. She claimed it. It was not a wish anymore. It was a decision, made in a kitchen in March, with no one there to see her make it. She walked back down the draw in the last of the snow, carrying a book bound in freight hide, with 2 hands' worth of writing in it now, and she was, though not one soul in Cottonwood Bend knew it, the only person in that whole settlement who could stand up and make the dance happen. They didn't know. That was the strange, held-breath heart of that spring. She held the entire working knowledge of the thing they gathered for, the thing their winters bent toward, the one event that stitched the settlement together, and to every last one of them she was still just the widow on the thin claim. Useful, invited to nothing. A complication in a ladder-back chair. And the 4th fall social was already being spoken of, because this one was going to be more than a dance. This one, they'd decided, would be the collection night for the schoolhouse stove, the good iron stove the school needed before winter, that they were $47 short of buying, with the first hard snow expected by the harvest moon. If the social filled the box, the children had heat by first snow. If it didn't, they didn't. And Verna Halloran was already arranging the sets in her head, and the settlement was already saying, quietly, kindly, the way small places say such things, that the widow Whitfield would do well to marry Del Farrow, the comfortable widower with the good ranch, and be sensible about it at last. And Elias Reddick stood at the back of the planning, saying nothing, counted as no one. None of them knew what was coming up the draw with the snow. None of them knew that the corner by the cold stove had not been a place of exile for 3 years at all. It had been a school. The word went out in April. The 4th fall social would be the biggest yet. Not because the settlement had grown much, because this time the dancing had a job. The schoolhouse needed a stove, a good iron one, the kind that held a fire through a Wyoming night and let a child sit through arithmetic without his fingers going blue. The schoolmaster had priced it in town. He came back with a number and a long face. They were $47 short. And the first hard snow was expected by the harvest moon, so the social would be the collection. Dance and give. Fill the box, or the children shivered through their sums come December. Simple as that. Verna Halloran took charge of it, the way she took charge of everything. She sat in her front room through the summer and arranged the sets in her head. The Coles across from the Ambroses. The Pruitts down near the door. The Standishes up by the window, well clear of the Pruitts, because everyone knew about that. She did not know why she knew to keep them apart. She only knew it was done. She thought it was her own good sense. It was not. It was Gideon Marsh, 20 years of steering 2 families to opposite ends of the room, so an old quarrel over a water line never spilled onto a dance floor. Verna had never once caught him at it. Cora had. Cora knew whose hand really kept the peace at every social Verna thought she ran. And through all of it, the settlement talked about the widow Whitfield. Kindly. That was the worst of it. They talked kindly. Del Ferro had a good ranch and a sound house and no wife, and he was a decent enough man. And wasn't it a shame? A woman alone on that thin claim east of the creek. Another winter coming. She ought to be sensible. She ought to marry Del and be warm. They said it the way you'd say a field ought to be plowed. Not unkind. Just settled. Just decided, by everyone, for her. Cora heard it the way you hear weather. She let it pass over. And Elias Reddick stood at the back of the planning meeting and said nothing at all. He was counted as no one. He counted himself as no one. He had come to 3 socials and touched his hat and mended a chair leg in an empty room and never once let his voice cross the floor to her. He thought that was respect. He was beginning, very slowly, to suspect it was cowardice. He did not yet know what to do about it. None of them knew the thing that was true. Cora carried the whole social in her head now. Every tune. Every call. The order that kept a floor from going flat at 9 o'clock. Which families to split. When to slow a set so the old folks could breathe, and when to run it fast so the young ones stayed. She had it all. And to every soul in Cottonwood Bend, she was still the complication in the corner. The night of the 4th social came in cool and clear. A good harvest moon, low and orange over the ridge, and snow already sitting white on the high rocks. First snow on the valley floor was maybe 3 weeks out. Maybe less. The schoolhouse filled early. More than ever before. The stove fund had done that. People came who hadn't come in years, coins in their pockets, ready to give and to dance for the giving. The lamps were lit. The benches pushed back. The floor swept clean. The collection box sat on the schoolmaster's desk by the door. Empty. Waiting. Cora took her chair by the cold stove. Same chair. The one that used to wobble and didn't anymore. She set the freight hide book in her lap and folded her hands over it and waited, the way she always waited. The fiddler's chair beside her was empty. She noticed it first. Of course she did. She'd sat beside that chair for 3 years. She knew the shape of Gideon in it, the tilt of the old man, the fiddle tucked under his gray chin. The empty chair looked wrong the way a missing tooth looks wrong. 8 o'clock came. Gideon did not. Verna clapped her hands and called the first set together. The Coles and the Ambroses took the floor, laughing, ready. They stood in their squares. They waited. There was no music. A boy had been sent up the draw to Gideon's cabin. He came back at 8:15, out of breath, and he found Verna and he told her low, and Cora watched Verna's face change. The boy said Gideon's hand had quit, not aching, not stiff. Quit. The 2 good fingers had gone the way of the ruined ones, sometime in the last week, quiet as a lamp going out. He could not hold the bow at all now. He had sent the book down with a neighbor days ago and told no one why. That was the book in Cora's lap. He had known. He had said his goodbye to the fiddle without a word to the settlement, and he was not coming. Not tonight. Not ever again. Verna stood in the middle of the floor with 40 people around her and no music to move them. You could watch her try. That was the terrible thing. She clapped her hands again, brisk, as if brisk would summon a tune. She called the Ambroses forward. She named the set. She arranged and arranged. She was very good at arranging. She had the Coles here and the Ambroses there and the Pruitts by the door, all in their proper squares, all facing the right way, and not one of them could take a single step, because there was nothing to step to. A dance without a fiddler is not a quiet dance. It is a room. 40 grown people standing in squares in a schoolhouse, looking at their boots, waiting for a sound that isn't coming. That's all it is. A room full of people who came to do a thing they suddenly can't do. 20 minutes went by. The squares broke up. People drifted to the benches. The young ones went outside to the dark. The old ones sat down heavy. Somebody tried to hum a tune to get a set going and couldn't hold it, and gave up, red-faced. Somebody else said maybe next month. Somebody said it was a shame about the stove. The stove. The collection box sat on the desk, still empty. Nobody puts money in a box at a party that has stopped being a party. You don't give at a wake. And this was turning into a wake, for the evening, for the fund, for the stove, for a winter of warm children that was slipping away right there in the lamplight while 40 neighbors watched and could not stop it. Verna Halloran stood by the desk. Her sets were perfect. Her floor was dead. She had organized everything a social could contain except the one thing that made it a social. And for the first time in her life, she had nothing to say. Her authority was the authority of arranging dancers. Take away the dancing, and she was a woman in a good dress in a quiet room. 40 minutes. The lamps burned. The snow sat on the ridge, closer than it had been. And Wes Halloran, Verna's own son, 22 years old and no kind of hero, stood up from the bench. He wasn't thinking about rules. He was thinking about the stove, and the cold, and the children, and the terrible dead room his mother couldn't fix. He was a practical young man. He looked around for anyone who might know what to do, and his eye fell, the way no one's eye ever fell, on the corner by the cold stove. On the widow Whitfield, who had sat next to the fiddler for 3 years, who had a book in her lap. He didn't know what he knew. He only knew she'd sat there. He crossed the floor. His boots were the only sound in the schoolhouse. Everyone heard them. Everyone turned. The widow in the corner, and Verna's earnest son walking to her across the empty boards, and the whole settlement gone still to watch, not knowing why they were watching. He stopped in front of the cold stove. He took off his hat. He said it plain. "Mrs. Whitfield, Gideon's not coming. His hand's done." He swallowed. "You sat by him 3 years. I don't know who else to ask." He looked at the book in her lap. "Would you call for us? Could you?" The room heard it. Every ear in the place. The widow, "Call the dance." And Cora Whitfield sat very still and did not answer for 4 seconds. 4 seconds is nothing. Say it, and it's gone. But she lived a long time inside those 4 seconds. Because she knew exactly what it cost. She had known for 2 years. A woman who calls a dance is never asked to one. That was the rule. Verna's rule, and the settlements, and it was iron. To stand up now was to stop, forever and in front of everyone. Being a woman, a man might cross a floor to lead. She would move out of that line and into another and never move back. Del Faro, and the good ranch, and being sensible, and being warm, all of it ran through those 4 seconds. She could stay in the chair. She could stay askable. She could shake her head and be, one more time, the widow who did nothing, and keep the small last hope she'd been told to be grateful for. Or she could stand up and be the only person in the room who could save it, and give up the hope to do it. 3 years of sitting. She thought of Gideon's hand. She thought of the children blue-fingered over their sums. She thought of the book, warm and heavy, full of her own handwriting now beside his. She had already decided this, hadn't she? In a kitchen in March. With no one watching. She stood up. The chair scraped back. She set the book on the seat behind her. She didn't need it, but she set it there anyway, the way you keep a friend's hand near. And she walked to the caller's place at the head of the floor, past Wes, past Verna, into the light where everyone could see her, the widow from the corner, and she turned around and faced the room. "We'll need the fiddle," she said. Her voice carried clean to the back wall. "Who plays a little?" Nobody moved. Then a young man near the door, one of the Coles, said he could scratch out a few things. Not well. Cora told him to fetch Gideon's fiddle from the empty chair, the one carried down with the book. She told him not to worry about being fine. She'd carry the tune. He only had to follow her count. That was the thing none of them understood yet. She didn't need a good fiddler. She needed hands and strings. The music was in her. "Cole's here," she said, and pointed, and her voice had changed. It had the old platform in it now, her father's Ohio platform, the pitch that reaches the last row. Ambrose is across. Standish is up by the window. A small pause, so small only one person in the room could have caught the reason for it. Prewitt's by the door. "You'll dance the far side tonight." She split them without a blink. The two families that must never share a set went to opposite ends of her floor and never knew they'd been steered, and the only other man who'd ever done that steering was up the draw in a dark cabin with a dead hand, and he would never know she'd done it perfect on her first night. But she knew. She felt him in it. "Give me a reel," she said to the boy with the fiddle. "Slow. I'll bring you up." He drew the bow. It was thin and scared and off. Cora clapped the time, 2 beats, 3, found it, and then she opened her mouth and called. "Honor your partner." Circle left. And the count under it, steady as a heartbeat, her voice pulling the shaky fiddle up onto the rhythm like a hand under an elbow. The Coles moved. The Ambroses moved. The squares that had stood dead for 40 minutes came alive, first stiff, then sure, then laughing, and the floor of the Cottonwood Bend schoolhouse was dancing again to a woman's voice. The room did not clap. It was too surprised to clap. It just began, helplessly, to move. Cora ran the first hour without a single stumble. She read the floor the way Gideon had taught her. When a set went flat, she changed the figure. When the old folks flagged, she called a slower tune and let them breathe, and when the young blood got restless, she cut it loose and ran a fast one until they whooped. She kept the shaky fiddler on his feet with her count, and when he found his nerve, she let him go a little, and the music got better because she made room for it to. She never raised her voice in anger, and never lost the room for a second. By the end of that first hour, the schoolhouse was fuller than any social in living memory. Word had gone out the door, and up the road, the widows calling the dance, "Come see." And people came, and people stayed, and the ones who stayed reached into their pockets. Because a full room is a generous room. The collection box that had sat empty as a grave filled up coin by coin, dollar by dollar, and the schoolmaster stood by his desk and watched it fill and could not quite believe what he was watching. The stove fund that had been dying at 8:30 was climbing. And that was Axis 1, the public thing, the survival of the whole gathering, turning on the voice of the woman nobody sat in a set. But there was the other axis too, the quieter one, and it took a little longer to show. It showed in the second hour. By the second hour, the room had stopped being surprised and started simply dancing, and the dancing pulled everyone in, because that is what a good caller does. She leaves no one at the wall. And so, one by one, the married women took the floor, the women who arranged the sets, the women who for 3 years had arranged one widow out of every single one. Cora sent them where the figures needed them. Not cruelly, not with any point to make. She just called the dance, and the dance needed bodies in places, and she put them there, and they went. They went because the caller said so. That was the whole thing. On this floor, tonight, the caller said where you stood. And in the middle of the third set of that second hour, Cora Whitfield called a figure that sent Verna Halloran across the floor and back. She didn't single her out. She'd never do that. She called ladies chain, and the ladies chained, and Verna was one of the ladies. And Verna gave her hand, and turned, and came back the way the call told her to, moving to the widow's count, in a set she had not arranged, on a floor she did not run, and there was no word said about it at all. No triumph, no look. The transfer of the whole thing, the authority of the social passing clean across the room from the woman who owned it to the woman in the corner, happened in silence, in a ladies' chain, witnessed by everyone and remarked on by no one. Because the music was going, and you don't stop to remark in the middle of a reel. Verna felt it, though. You could see her feel it. Somewhere in that turn she understood what had happened to her, and to the widow, and to 3 years of arranging, and her face went through something complicated, and then, to her credit, because she was not a bad woman, only a certain kind of woman, it settled into something almost like relief. The floor was saved. Her son had thought of it. The stove would be bought. And she was dancing. She let herself dance. Del Faro was there too. The sensible match. The good ranch. He stood at the edge for a while, and then he took a place in a set because everyone was, and he danced a little, and he was a perfectly pleasant man, having a perfectly pleasant time, and at no point in the whole night did the evening bend toward him even once. He was the obvious answer to a question the night simply wasn't asking. Nobody thought about Cora and Del that evening. There wasn't room for it. The widow wasn't a problem to be sensibly solved tonight. She was the reason they were all still standing there. And at the back wall, against the boards, in the shadow past the lamplight, Elias Reddick had not moved. He had not danced. He had not crossed the floor. He had not taken a place in any set. He stood exactly where he'd stood at the start, and a person watching might have thought he was the one man in Cottonwood Bend the evening had failed to touch. They'd have been wrong. He hadn't moved because he was listening. He was listening the way a man listens for one particular sound in a storm of sound. He had come to 4 socials now. He had come for something. And he was standing very still because he had begun to think that tonight, at last, he might hear it. Late in that second hour, Cora turned a page in her head and called for a reel she had not called yet that night. "The Sweetwater," she said. A few of the old ones lifted their heads. They knew that name. Everybody in the territory over 50 knew that name. Gideon Marsh's reel, the one he'd hauled up and down 40 years of freight road, the one he played at every social. The first part of it anyway. Because there was a second part to the Sweetwater reel, a turn most fiddlers never learned, and Gideon's hand had killed a decade back. And nobody in Cottonwood Bend had heard the whole of it played in 10 years. Most had forgotten it even had a second part. They only knew the tune stopped where it always stopped, half-finished, like a sentence trailing off. Cora clapped the time. The boy found the first part, that everyone knew, and the floor ran it, happy and familiar. And then, the tune came to the place where it always died, the place where Gideon's bow used to lift, and the reel just ended. And Cora kept calling. She took the fiddler's ear with her voice, and she carried him up and over into the second part. The turn, the high, strange, lovely part that had been sitting locked in that freight hide book for 10 years, that Gideon had taught her in his cold kitchen with his ruined hands on the table, because his fingers no longer could, and the boy followed her, note by note, into music the room had never heard. And the second part of the Sweetwater reel opened up in the Cottonwood Bend schoolhouse like a door swinging wide onto a room nobody knew was there. The floor felt it. You could see them feel it. The tune they thought they knew turned out to have more in it, a whole further country, and they danced into it grinning and startled, and the old ones who remembered the reel stopped dancing altogether and just stood there with their mouths open, because a dead thing had come back to life in front of them. And at the back wall, Elias Reddick closed his eyes. That was all. He closed his eyes and stood against the boards and let the second part of the Sweetwater reel wash over him. And if anyone had been watching his face instead of the dancing, they'd have seen a man come, quietly and completely, to the end of a very long wait. The dance went 3 hours. When it was done, the floor was wrung out and glowing, and the lamps were burning low, and people were pulling on coats, still humming, and the schoolmaster stood up on the bench by his desk, with the collection box in his 2 hands. He didn't make a speech. He wasn't a speech man. He just held up the box, heavy now, and he counted it out loud so the room could hear, and the number he reached was past what they needed. Past the 47. Past the whole price of the stove. He said it twice because he didn't believe it the first time. The stove was bought. The children had heat. The snow could come whenever it liked. And then, He did the one thing that mattered. He said who did it. He looked across the emptying floor to the woman standing at the caller's place with a freight hide book in her hands, and he said, so the whole settlement heard him, that they owed the evening, and the fund, and the winter, to Mrs. Whitfield, that without her there'd have been no dance, and no dollars and no stove, that she'd saved it. Nobody argued. Verna Halloran, buttoning her coat, did not argue. The people who had never once put the widow in a set stood in the low lamplight and looked at her, and something in the whole room resorted itself, quietly, the way things do when a thing everyone believed turns out to have been wrong the whole time. She was not the complication in the corner. She never had been. She was the one person in Cottonwood Bend who had spent 3 years learning the only thing that could save them, and they had given her those 3 years by accident, by leaving her alone next to a fiddle, and she had used every minute of them. The floor emptied, the coats went out into the cold, and the widow Whitfield stood at the head of the room, tired to the bone and lit up inside like a window, holding the book. And the man at the back wall finally moved. Elias Reddick came across the floor, not the practical crossing, the one Wes had made. A slower one. He came all the way to the caller's place, and he stopped in front of her, and he took off his hat, the way he always did, and this time he did not put it back on and go. He did not ask her to dance. Everyone else in that room, if they'd asked her anything at all, would have asked her that. It was the shape of the whole night. The widow who called the dance and gave up being asked to one. 4 seconds, and she'd chosen the floor over the chance, and she'd known exactly what she was trading, and she'd traded it clean. She had stood up knowing no man would ever cross a room to lead her out again. That was the cost. She'd paid it, and she didn't regret it. So Elias Reddick did not ask her to dance. He asked her something else. Mrs. Whitfield. His voice was low and rusty from not being used. That reel. The Sweetwater. He turned his hat in his hands. There's a second part to it. I heard it tonight, first time in, a long time. He looked at her, and it cost him, you could see it cost him. My wife used to hum it. The second part. She'd hum it doing the wash, and I never learned it off her, and then she was gone, and it went with her. A breath. I've come to 4 of these, waiting to hear somebody finish that tune. Nobody ever could. His eyes came up. You did. He stood there, the hat turned in his hands. Do you know it? He said. The whole of it? Would you teach it to me? So it's not lost. So somebody keeps it. And Cora Whitfield understood. He had not asked her to dance. He had asked her the one question no one in Cottonwood Bend had ever thought to ask the widow in the corner. Not can I lead you, not will you be sensible, not won't you be warm. He had asked her to be the keeper of something. He had asked because she knew a thing worth knowing, and because he had watched her long enough and quiet enough to guess she was the one who'd know it. He had asked to be taught. He had asked her to be, out loud and on purpose, the exact thing 3 years in a corner had made her. He had asked to know her. She had just given up being asked to dance, and here was a man who had never once asked her to, standing in the low lamplight, asking her something deeper than the floor. She looked at his tired, honest face, and she thought of a woman doing the wash and humming a reel she never got to finish, and she felt the whole shape of the last 3 years turn over in her hands and come up, at last, as something whole. Yes, she said, I know the whole of it. And that was the beginning, though neither of them said so that night. Come spring, she was calling the planting time dance at the front of the schoolhouse, as a matter of course, the way you'd call it any year, as though there'd never been a corner or a cold stove or a wobbling chair. The freight hide book had gone soft at the edges from her hands. She barely opened it anymore. It lived on the caller's chair beside her, Gideon's writing and hers together, and she called from memory and let it sit there like company. And beside her, at the fiddle, sat Elias Reddick. He'd taught himself over that winter. slow and stubborn, up the draw at his homestead, scraping and sawing until the strings gave him something like music, and then better than that, and Cora had taught him the Sweetwater reel. Both parts, the whole of it. In a warm kitchen this time, with the lamp lit and the snow deep outside. And every social now, when they came to the place where the tune used to die, they went on through it together, her voice and his bow, and the reel got finished every single time. Gideon heard about it, up in his cabin. They say the old man smiled. A year on, at the harvest social, the stove roaring iron hot in the corner where the cold one used to stand, Verna Halloran came up to the caller's place between sets. She was older and softer, and she stood a moment before she said it. "I never knew," she said, "that you could do such a thing. All those years." She shook her head, wondering at it. "I never knew you had it in you." And Cora Whitfield looked at her, kind and plain, and gave her the only answer there was. "You gave me 3 years to learn." Then she turned back to the floor, and she clapped the time, and she called the dance, and the whole warm room got up and moved to the sound of the widow's voice. Because that was the truth of it, the thing the whole settlement finally understood. The woman who waits at the edge of a room and the woman who runs it were the same woman all along. She was never really at the edge. She was the only person in that whole place who had spent 3 years learning something. They just didn't see it until the fiddle went quiet. Somewhere out there, there's a corner in a room you were put in and told to be grateful for. And maybe, like Cora, you've been learning the whole time. If a place like Cottonwood Bend ever kept you at the edge of the floor, tell me the name of your town in the comments. I read every one.